In the quiet suburban town of Millbrook, 16-year-old Andre Johnson walked home from basketball practice one crisp autumn evening, his mind focused on the upcoming championship game. The streetlights had just begun to flicker on, casting long shadows across the peaceful neighborhood where he'd grown up. His navy blue school hoodie kept him warm as the evening breeze rustled through the trees lining the street. Andre was a straight-A student, captain of his high school basketball team, and had already started receiving interest letters from several prestigious universities. His mother, Denise, worked as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital, and she'd raised him with strong values and an unwavering belief in education. What most people in town didn't know was that Andre's father wasn't in the picture, or so he thought. As he walked past the local convenience store, Officer Richard Cooper's patrol car slowly cruised by. Andre noticed the vehicle pass him once, then twice, before pulling up beside him. His heart rate quickened, but he remained calm, remembering his mother's advice about staying composed in such situations. "Hey, you! Stop right there," Officer Cooper called out, stepping out of his vehicle. "There's been a robbery reported in the area, and you match the description." Andre's confusion was evident as he stopped walking. "Sir, I'm just heading home from basketball practice. I live 3 blocks away, and my mom's expecting me." Officer Cooper approached him, his hand resting on his belt. "Sure, kid. That's what they all say. Put your hands where I can see them." Despite Andre calmly explaining his situation and offering to call his mother or his basketball coach, Officer Cooper proceeded to handcuff him. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, some recording the incident on their phones, while others recognized Andre and started protesting the officer's actions. Mrs. Henderson, Andre's elderly neighbor who had known him since he was a toddler, stepped forward. "Officer, this is Andre Johnson. He's lived here his whole life. I just saw him leave for practice this afternoon." But Officer Cooper remained unmoved. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business." What nobody realized at that moment was that this incident would unravel a truth that had been buried for 16 years. As Andre sat in the back of the patrol car, his mother was already being notified, and across town, in the police department's upper offices, Chief David Williams received an urgent call that would change everything. The news of Andre's wrongful arrest spread quickly through social media, with video clips showing his dignified composure despite the unjust treatment. Local news vans began arriving at the scene, and community members gathered outside the police station in peaceful protest. Inside the station, Denise Johnson arrived, her hospital scrub still on from her shift. Her face was a mixture of anger and concern as she demanded to see her son. But before she could reach the holding area, Chief Williams appeared, his face ashen. He had just discovered something in the department's personnel files that would shake the foundation of not just the police force, but the entire community. The truth about Andre's father wasn't just a missing piece of his family history, it was about to become the key to exposing a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. As Chief Williams reviewed Officer Cooper's body camera footage alongside a 16-year-old personnel file, the connection between Andre's past and present began to emerge, setting in motion a series of events that would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about truth, justice, and the power of hidden connections. Meanwhile, Andre sat quietly in the holding cell, unaware that this moment of injustice would lead to a revelation that would change his life forever. His thoughts drifted to his mother, who had always told him that everything happens for a reason, though he couldn't imagine what reason could justify this situation. Little did he know, the answer to that question was hidden in a file that hadn't been opened in 16 years, and it was about to come to light in a way that would shock everyone in Millbrook. Chief Williams sat in his office, staring at the 2 files on his desk. One contained Officer Cooper's recent complaints about racial profiling, while the other was a dusty personnel file from 16 years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he connected the dots. The timestamp on Andre's arrest video showed 7:42 p.m., exactly 16 years to the minute since another incident that had changed the department forever. Down in the holding area, Denise Johnson paced back and forth, her hospital ID badge still swinging from her neck. Her normally calm demeanor was replaced with barely contained fury. "My son has never been in trouble a day in his life," she told the desk sergeant. "He's supposed to be giving a speech at tomorrow's school assembly about youth leadership." The desk sergeant, Officer Patricia Chen, had known Denise for years. Their kids had gone to elementary school together. She looked uncomfortably at her computer screen, then back at Denise. "There's something weird going on upstairs," she whispered. "Chief Williams has locked himself in his office and requested all of Officer Cooper's body cam footage from the last 6 months. Outside the police station, the crowd had grown. Andre's basketball teammates had arrived in their practice jerseys, standing quietly alongside concerned neighbors and community members. Local news reporters interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who spoke tearfully about Andre's character and his volunteer work at the senior center. Back in the holding cell, Andre sat on the bench, his mind racing. Through the small window, he could hear the growing crowd outside. But something else caught his attention, Officer Cooper's voice, rising in anger from around the corner. "What do you mean, I'm suspended pending investigation?" Cooper shouted. "This is ridiculous. I was doing my job." "Richard, you need to calm down," another officer responded. "The chief has evidence." "Evidence of what?" Cooper interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "This has nothing to do with what happened 16 years ago." Andre leaned forward, straining to hear more, but the voices moved away. The mention of 16 years struck something in his memory. His mother always became quiet around his birthday, looking at old photos when she thought he wasn't watching. Meanwhile, Chief Williams had finally gathered the courage to make a call he'd been dreading. He dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. "Hello, James," the chief said quietly. "It's about your son." There was a long pause on the other end. "Which officer?" the voice finally asked. "Cooper." "The same one who?" "I'm on my way." In the station's break room, Officer Chen was doing some digging of her own. She remembered something from when she first joined the force, a story about an undercover operation that went wrong, about an officer who left the force to protect his family. As she scrolled through old department photos on the wall, her eyes landed on a group picture from 16 years ago. In it, a younger Officer Cooper stood next to another officer who looked strikingly like an older version of Andre. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Upstairs, Denise had finally been allowed into Chief Williams' office. As she entered, she froze at the sight of the open personnel file on his desk, specifically, at the photo paperclip to the top corner. "You promised," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You promised he would never have to know." "Denise," Chief Williams said gently, "Cooper forced our hand. He's been targeting young black men in the neighborhood for months. We thought he was just profiling, but now we know he's been looking for Andre." He recognized the resemblance. Outside, a black SUV pulled up to the station. The crowd parted as a tall man in a suit stepped out. His salt and pepper hair and distinguished bearing commanded attention, but it was his face that caused murmurs to ripple through the crowd. Anyone who had seen Andre would recognize the resemblance immediately. James Thompson had spent 16 years working undercover, dismantling criminal organizations that had infiltrated police departments across the state. He'd given up everything, his career as a local officer, his family, his identity, to protect them from retaliation. Officer Cooper had been his partner back then, until James discovered Cooper's connections to the very organizations he was investigating. Now, as he walked into the station for the first time in 16 years, James knew his sacrifice had both protected and failed his son. The very man he'd been trying to protect Andre from had just arrested him, but perhaps this was finally the chance to expose the truth and reunite with his family. In the holding cell, Andre had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He was still thinking about Officer Cooper's outburst, about the 16-year mystery, about his mother's silent tears on his birthdays. Outside his cell, footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with purpose. The door opened to reveal Chief Williams, his mother, and a man he'd never met but somehow recognized. The man's eyes were filled with tears as he looked at Andre, seeing 16 years of missed moments in his son's face. "Andre," his mother said softly, "there's something we need to tell you. About your father. About why tonight happened. About everything." Chief Williams led Andre, Denise, and James to a private conference room away from prying eyes. The walls were lined with community service awards and old photographs of graduating police academy classes. Andre's eyes kept drifting to the man who was apparently his father, noting the familiar shape of their eyes, the same strong jawline he saw in his own reflection. "Son," James began, his voice thick with emotion, 16 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my life. I left to protect you and your mother, but I never stopped watching over you from afar." Andre sat perfectly still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The events of the evening felt surreal, from being wrongfully arrested to suddenly sitting across from the father he'd always wondered about. "You were a police officer?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than that," Chief Williams interjected, spreading photographs and documents across the table. "Your father was one of our best undercover investigators. He discovered a network of corrupt officers working with drug trafficking organizations, feeding them information, helping them avoid detection." Denise reached for Andre's hand, squeezing it gently. "Baby, your father didn't abandon us. He went deep undercover to protect us. Officer Cooper, the man who arrested you tonight, he was part of that corruption." James's face hardened at the mention of Cooper. "He was my partner back then. When I discovered his involvement, he threatened to expose my undercover status to the criminal organizations. But what scared me most was when he mentioned having photos of you and your mother, suggesting that accidents could happen." Andre's mind raced back to countless basketball games where he'd searched the crowds, hoping to spot a father who never seemed to exist. "But you were there?" he asked, looking at James. A sad smile crossed James's face. "Every game. State championships last year, you hit that three-pointer in the final seconds. I was in the back row, wearing a baseball cap. Your graduation from middle school, you gave that speech about community service. I was the janitor cleaning the hallway when you practiced it after school." Tears began rolling down Andre's cheeks as years of memories shifted, revealing new layers he'd never noticed before. The mysterious donation that funded the youth basketball program he coached. The anonymous tip that had saved his friend from a drug dealer targeting their school. The feeling of being watched, not menacingly, but protectively, during his late-night walks home from practice. Meanwhile, outside the conference room, Officer Cooper was facing his own reckoning. Internal affairs investigators had arrived, armed with 16 years' worth of evidence that James had carefully accumulated. Cooper's recent targeting of Andre wasn't just racial profiling, it was a desperate attempt to smoke out James Thompson, whom he suspected was still watching his son. "Your father documented everything," Chief Williams explained, pushing forward a thick file. "Every corrupt deal, every threat, every connection Cooper maintained with criminal organizations. But he couldn't expose it without putting our whole family at risk. Until tonight. Cooper got sloppy," James continued. "His obsession with finding me through you led him to make mistakes. Each time he pulled over a young black man matching your description, each time he manufactured reasons to search them or question them, it all built a pattern. A pattern that finally gives us enough to take him down legally, along with the last remnants of the network he protected." Officer Chen knocked on the conference room door, entering with a tablet displaying live news coverage. The story had exploded across social media. Hundreds more people had gathered outside the station, but it wasn't just about Andre anymore. Other families had come forward, sharing stories of harassment by Officer Cooper. Former officers were breaking their silence about corruption they'd witnessed years ago. "The truth is spreading," Chief Williams said, watching the footage. "Cooper's actions tonight didn't just reveal your father's identity to you, Andre. They gave us the final piece we needed to expose everything." Denise wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son process everything. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said softly. "Every time you asked about your father, every time you achieved something amazing, every time you faced injustice with the same quiet strength your father taught me. But keeping the secret kept you safe." Andre stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the crowd below. His teammates were still there, joined now by what seemed like half the town. Signs demanding justice had evolved into messages of support for the Thompson family and calls for police reform. "All these years," Andre said, turning back to face his parents, "I thought I was missing something." "Missing you," he looked at James. "But you were always there, weren't you? Every important moment?" James stepped forward cautiously, unsure if he'd earned the right to embrace his son. But Andre moved first, wrapping his arms around his father as 16 years of absence transformed into understanding. Denise joined them, their family whole for the first time since Andre was a baby. Outside the conference room, the system James had fought so long to change was finally shifting. Officer Cooper was being led out in handcuffs, his former colleagues turning their backs as he passed. Chief Williams had already announced a complete departmental review, promising transparency and reform. But in that moment, in that conference room, none of that mattered as much as three people finding their way back to each other. Andre's wrongful arrest had turned into something none of them expected, a chance for truth to finally overcome fear, for justice to prevail not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient, protective love of a father for his son. The next morning, Millbrook woke up to a changed reality. The local newspaper's headline read, "Hero Undercover Officer Reunited with Son After 16 Years." News vans lined the streets, but they weren't just covering a story about racial profiling anymore, they were uncovering a decades-long saga of corruption, sacrifice, and redemption. Andre sat at his familiar spot at the kitchen table, but this time, both his parents were there. His mother prepared breakfast as she always did, while James carefully flipped through a photo album he'd kept hidden all these years. Each photo showed moments of Andre's life from a distance: first day of school, basketball games, academic awards. "This one," James said, pointing to a slightly blurry photo of Andre at age 7, "you were selling lemonade for the children's hospital. I bought 10 cups using different disguises." He chuckled softly. "Your mother probably thought that elderly woman with the floral dress was a bit odd." Denise smiled as she set down a plate of pancakes. "I remember her. She insisted on paying $5 per cup and kept saying what a fine young man Andre was becoming." Her eyes met James's, sharing years of unspoken understanding. At the police station, Chief Williams was conducting a press conference. "Today, we're announcing a complete overhaul of our department's oversight procedures," he declared to the assembled reporters. "The courage of the Thompson family has exposed not just individual misconduct, but systematic failures that we must address." Officer Chen stood at the back of the room, thinking about all the times she'd seen Cooper's suspicious behavior but hadn't connected the dots. She'd been appointed to lead a new internal review board, tasked with examining every case Cooper had handled over his career. Meanwhile, Andre's basketball team had organized a community meeting at the high school gymnasium. What started as a show of support for their team captain had evolved into a forum for positive change. Andre's coach, who had always been like a father figure to him, stood at the podium. "We're not here to divide our community," the coach announced to the packed bleachers. "We're here to learn from the Thompson family's story. Their strength, their patience, their commitment to justice through proper channels, that's the example we need to follow." Back at home, Andre and James sat on the front porch, making up for lost time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn where, unknowingly, father and son had both spent countless hours, Andre practicing his basketball shots, James watching from hidden positions to ensure his family's safety. "Did you ever want to just come home?" Andre asked, watching their neighbors drive by, some slowing down to wave supportively. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "Every single day. Especially when Cooper started working this beat. I knew his habits, knew he was looking for me. Every time he pulled over a young man who looked like you, my heart stopped. But I had to wait until we had enough evidence to dismantle the entire network." Inside, Denise was on the phone with the district attorney's office. Beyond Cooper's arrest, there were now investigations into 3 other officers in neighboring districts. James's meticulous documentation over the years had created a map of corruption that stretched across the state. "The DA says they're expediting the cases," she reported, joining them on the porch. "They're offering immunity to some of the lower-level officers in exchange for testimony about the drug trafficking connections." The afternoon brought more visitors. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her famous sweet potato pie, just as she'd done every Sunday for years. But this time, she hugged James tightly. "I saw you, you know," she said with a gentle smile. "All those times you watched from your car. I may be old, but I'm not blind. I just never knew the whole story." Andre's teammates showed up next, basketballs in hand. They'd postponed practice but wanted to show their support. To their surprise, James joined them in the driveway for a quick game. Years of undercover work hadn't diminished his skills, now Andre knew where his natural talent came from. As they played, more neighbors gathered. Someone brought chairs, another arrived with coolers of drinks. The impromptu gathering became a celebration of community resilience. Parents who'd worried about their own children's safety now had hope for real change. Kids who'd grown up hearing, "Be careful around the police," were seeing a new narrative unfold. Chief Williams stopped by briefly, bringing news that Cooper had started talking, hoping for a reduced sentence. "He's naming names," the chief told James quietly. "The same organizations you've been tracking all these years, they're finally starting to crumble." As evening approached, Andre found himself sitting between his parents on the porch steps, watching the neighborhood kids play basketball in his driveway. The fear and anger of the previous night had transformed into something powerful, a sense of purpose, of justice served not through violence or revenge, but through perseverance and truth. "You know," Andre said, looking at his father, "all those times I wished for you to be here, you actually were. Just not the way I imagined." James wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "From now on, I'll be here exactly the way you need me to be. No more shadows, no more distance." Denise watched her 2 men, seeing in both their faces the same strength that had carried them through 16 years of separation. "Our story isn't just ours anymore," she observed, noting the news van quietly filming from down the street. "It belongs to everyone who needs to believe that truth eventually comes to light." As the sun set over Millbrook, the Thompson family remained on their porch, no longer hiding, no longer separated by secrets. Their story had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes justice takes time, patience, and the unwavering love of a father who sacrificed everything to protect his family. A week after the arrest that changed everything, Andre stood at the podium in his school's auditorium. The assembly he was supposed to give about youth leadership had transformed into something much more significant. Students, teachers, and community members packed the seats, while local news cameras rolled in the back. "Last week, I thought I knew who I was," Andre began, his voice steady. "A student, an athlete, a kid raised by a strong single mother. But life has a way of revealing deeper truths. Today, I stand before you not just as Andre Johnson, but as Andre Thompson, son of one of the bravest men I've ever known." In the front row, James and Denise sat together, their hands clasped. The past week had been a whirlwind of debriefings, interviews, and family conversations that stretched late into the night. Each day brought new revelations about the extent of James's undercover work and the corruption he'd helped expose. My father spent 16 years in the shadows, Andre continued, not because he didn't love us, but because he loved us enough to protect us at any cost. He taught me, without even being present, that real courage isn't about confrontation, it's about dedication to what's right, no matter how long it takes. The investigation into Officer Cooper had expanded rapidly. Chief Williams, sitting in the audience, had spent the week coordinating with federal authorities. Cooper's arrest had triggered a domino effect, leading to investigations in 3 neighboring states. The drug trafficking network that James had monitored for so long was finally unraveling. But this isn't just about my family, Andre said, gesturing to the diverse crowd before him. It's about every family that has felt the weight of prejudice, every person who has faced unfair treatment, every community that has struggled to trust those sworn to protect them. Change doesn't always come the way we expect it to. In the audience, Officer Chen dabbed at her eyes. The past week had been transformative for the police department. As head of the new review board, she'd already identified 20 cases that needed immediate review. More importantly, officers were coming forward voluntarily, sharing instances of misconduct they'd witnessed but had been afraid to report. The school principal had turned the assembly into a community forum. After Andre's speech, other students began sharing their own experiences. The atmosphere wasn't one of anger or accusation, but of hope and determination for change. James's story had shown them that justice was possible, even if it took time and patience. During the lunch break, Andre found himself surrounded by his teammates in the cafeteria. They'd stood by him through everything, and now they were helping him adjust to his new reality. His father had become a regular at their practices, sharing stories of his own high school basketball days between drills. "You know what's crazy?" Andre's best friend said, picking at his lunch. "Your dad was there all along. Like, remember that time we got hassled by those drug dealers behind the mall? They suddenly backed off for no reason. Bet that was him watching out for you." James had indeed been there that day, as he'd been present for countless other moments. His years undercover hadn't just been about gathering evidence, they'd been about being an invisible guardian for his son. Now, finally, he could step into the light and be the father he'd always wanted to be. The afternoon brought more developments. Chief Williams received word that federal prosecutors were preparing indictments against 12 officers in 3 states. The evidence James had gathered over 16 years was proving invaluable. Cooper, facing serious charges, had started cooperating fully, desperate for leniency. After school, Andre walked home with both his parents for the first time. Neighbors waved from their porches, no longer whispering about the mysterious man who used to watch from afar. The Thompson family had become a symbol of resilience and hope in Millbrook. The youth center called again, Denise mentioned as they walked. "They want both of you to speak at their program next week. Your story is inspiring a lot of people." James nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe some good can come from all those years apart. If our experience helps bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, maybe it was worth it." At home, Andre found a letter in the mail from the State Basketball Commission. They were reviewing the eligibility rules that had previously prevented kids with single parents from receiving certain scholarships. His case had sparked a broader conversation about family circumstances and opportunities in youth sports. The evening news played in the background as the family prepared dinner together. The top story was about the ongoing investigation, but it wasn't focused on scandal or controversy. Instead, it highlighted the positive changes emerging from the revelation of James's undercover work. Reform committees are being established in police departments across the state, the reporter announced. The Thompson case has become a catalyst for examining how law enforcement handles internal investigations and community relations. Later that night, Andre sat on the roof outside his bedroom window, a spot where he'd often gone to think. His father climbed out to join him, moving with the same quiet grace that had kept him hidden for so many years. "You know what's strange?" Andre said, looking at the stars. "A week ago, I thought finding out about you would answer all my questions. Instead, it's teaching me that some answers take time, and that's okay." James smiled, recognizing his own patience reflected in his son's wisdom. Life rarely gives us the endings we expect. Sometimes it gives us something better, the chance to make real change. Below them, Denise called out about a phone call from the governor's office. They wanted the Thompson family to participate in a state commission on police reform. Their story was opening doors that had long been closed, creating opportunities for meaningful dialogue and change. As father and son climbed back inside, Andre paused at the window. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, but everything was different. His family's story had become more than just a tale of reunion, it was proving that justice, love, and truth could prevail, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. 1 month after the night that changed everything, the Thompson family stood together outside the newly renamed Justice and Community Center. The building, once a symbol of the divide between law enforcement and the community, was being transformed into a space for dialogue, education, and healing. Andre adjusted his tie, preparing to address the crowd gathered for the center's opening ceremony. At 16, he'd become an unexpected bridge between generations, between communities, between past and present. The past month had taught him more about courage and justice than any textbook ever could. Sometimes, he began, looking out at the familiar faces, the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. "A month ago, I was just walking home from basketball practice. Today, I'm standing here because that walk became a catalyst for change that none of us could have imagined." In the front row, Officer Chen sat beside Chief Williams. The police department had undergone significant transformations. Cooper's case had led to 27 arrests across 4 states, dismantling a corruption network that had persisted for decades. More importantly, it had sparked a revolution in police training and community relations. "My father taught me something without even being present," Andre continued, glancing at James. "He showed me that real change doesn't come from confrontation or violence. It comes from patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to truth." James stood tall beside Denise, no longer hiding in shadows. The past month had been about more than just reconnecting with his family, it had been about helping other families heal too. His experience had become a template for departments nationwide, showing how to rebuild trust between law enforcement and communities. The Justice and Community Center wasn't just a building. Inside, classrooms were set up for youth programs, meeting spaces for community dialogues, and offices for social workers and counselors. One room was dedicated to the Thompson Family Scholarship Fund, supporting children of law enforcement officers who chose to expose corruption. "What happened to our family wasn't unique," Andre said, his voice strong and clear. "What made it different was how the truth came to light. Not through violence or revenge, but through years of patient work for justice. My father spent 16 years gathering evidence, not just to protect us, but to protect every family in every community affected by corruption." Denise watched her son with pride. The past month had seen him grow from a teenager dealing with shocking revelations to a young man helping shape his community's future. His basketball team had made it to the state finals, but more importantly, they'd started a peer mentoring program connecting young athletes with law enforcement families. Chief Williams stepped up to the podium next, announcing new transparency initiatives that would be implemented statewide. "The Thompson family showed us that real change requires more than just new policies," he declared. "It requires heart, courage, and the willingness to believe in something bigger than ourselves." The afternoon celebrations included the unveiling of a new mural on the center's wall. It showed 2 hands clasped together, one in a police uniform sleeve, the other in a basketball jersey. Above it, the words, truth, justice, community, shone in bright colors. Local artists had worked with youth groups to create the image, turning pain into beauty. Later, as families mingled in the center's courtyard, André found himself surrounded by younger kids from his basketball program. They no longer just saw him as their coach, he'd become living proof that standing up for truth could create real change. "Your dad was like a superhero," one young boy said excitedly. "Living undercover to protect people." André smiled, remembering how he'd processed similar thoughts over the past month. "The real superpower," he replied, "was never giving up on doing what's right, even when it was hard." James had started a special program at the center, working with officers who wanted to report misconduct but feared retaliation. His years of experience had taught him how to protect whistleblowers while building solid cases. Already, departments in other states were adopting his methods. As evening approached, the Thompson family gathered in what would become James's new office at the center. Photos lined the walls, not just the distant surveillance shots from years past, but new pictures of their family together, whole and healing. "You know," Denise said, arranging a frame on the desk, "all those years I worried about telling André the truth. Now I see that the truth was exactly what everyone needed." The center would officially open its doors the next day. Programs were already filled to capacity: community mediation sessions, youth sports leagues, police community dialogue groups. What had started with one wrongful arrest had blossomed into a movement for positive change. André's basketball teammates had painted their court with a new slogan: "Play with truth, lead with justice." The team had dedicated their season to promoting unity between law enforcement and the community, wearing special jerseys that bore both a police badge and a basketball. As the sun set on their first month as a reunited family, the Thompsons stood together on the center's roof, overlooking their transformed community. Police cars drove by with new logos promoting community partnership. Children played basketball with off-duty officers. Former adversaries sat together in meditation gardens, finding common ground. A month ago, André reflected, "I thought finding my father would be the end of a story. Instead, it was just the beginning." James put his arms around his wife and son, finally able to hold them without fear of exposure. "Every end is a beginning," he said softly. "What matters is how we use our stories to help others write theirs." Below them, the last visitors were leaving the center's opening ceremony. But tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, new opportunities for healing. The Thompson family had shown their community that justice was possible, that truth could prevail, and that love, patient, persistent, protective love, could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength and hope. As night fell over Millbrook, the lights of the Justice and Community Center glowed like a beacon, promising that even the longest journeys toward truth and reconciliation could lead to something beautiful. The Thompson family's story had become more than just a tale of reunion. It had become a testament to the power of unwavering faith in justice, the strength of family bonds, and the possibility of positive change in even the most challenging circumstances.